I'm a professor emeritus at Harvard, and for the last 7 years, after teaching there for 45 years, Tess and I moved to London, and I'm an honorary professor at the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis at University College London, which is a research institution mainly with postdoctoral students and PhD students, and about half a dozen very senior people who keep the thing going. And I teach. When I decided about 10 years ago that what I wanted to do was teach teachers, faculty in universities, how to collaborate across disciplines on large, complicated geodesign problems. You might call them planning problems. It's this mix of science and planning, information technology, and always highly politically charged, serious problems. And I do that about once a month somewhere in the world, and it's organized in advance. I'm always working with former students or with people who I know can handle these kinds of studies. And I gather faculty across disciplines and sometimes professionals and government people. And we attack in a workshop format that might be anywhere from a day to 3 days, sometimes 4 days, this problem. And in the course of doing that, I'm teaching how to teach, and I'm teaching how to organize, and I'm carrying forward a project in which I'm dealing with faculty members and professionals as though they were my graduate students. And it's something that I've done now many, many times. I do one about once a month somewhere in the world.
So how do you define geodesign?
This is a word that I didn't invent. It was invented by 3 different people who didn't know each other in the 1990s, who used it for the first time in publications, so we know that. Geodesign applies systems thinking to large problems of planning, basically. And the word design is important. The word design has a noun meaning and a verb meaning. For most people, the word, when used as a noun, could be a painting, a sculpture, an architect's building. But the word as a verb means by intent, to change something by intent, to make something by intent.
Right.
And so what I've done for 50 years, basically, is work on large geographic change problems in which intentional change has to be brought about. And that's why geo, meaning large, geographic, whatever, territory, and design, meaning intentional change. Seems like a very effective word.
Then how do you see this evolving?
Well, the first International Congress was 5 years ago. There were about 200 people. And now there have been 5 of these meetings in the United States, and 2 in China, and 2 in Japan, and 2 in Europe. And I wrote the first book, and now there's a whole bunch of publications and projects. And the last meeting, they had no room for more people. So there's a growing awareness. Let me say this in a more complicated way. There's a community of people who uses the word of geodesign as a rubric for encompassing the people who work with IT with information technologies and these problems. But there are an awful lot of people doing very similar things, and they don't use the word because the word is a new one. I mean, they might be called landscape planners, they might be called geographical analyst, projection people. There's just all kinds of people. And what seems to be generic, what seems to be worldwide, is that people realize that when you have a complicated problem, you have to have strategies for attacking it. And in some cases, these are vertical strategies, meaning the specialists each do their own work. And at the same time, the generalists or teams of people have to figure out a way to relate those specialists' recommendations. And that combination of a vertical and a horizontal structure resulting in the design is what geodesign is fundamentally about. In other words, no one group of people, no science, no IT technology, no single person, and no design profession has command of this. It's a mixture. And you have to choreograph all these people into roles that eventually produce a design, or several if you don't want one. And organizing that is what the book, A Framework of Design for Design, is about. It's important to understand that geodesign is basically a process. It's not a person who's a geodesigner, I don't like that word, and it's not a thing which is a geodesign. It's a process. And it needs a structure, and that structure needs a framework. And it's not a theory, because it doesn't predict. And it's not a model, because it doesn't explain. It's a framework which organizes. And there are other frameworks in the world. And mine happens to be, I think, a pretty robust one. It's been applied lots of times by lots of people, most of whom are my friends and former students, but there are other people who are now beginning to use it that I don't even know. And people who have used it, I've never heard somebody say it doesn't work, and I've heard a lot of people say, gee, this was a very effective way of structuring the work that I'm doing, and that makes me very happy.
Would you say that it's something new?
No.
That it's repackaging older ideas?
I would say neither of those. I did a study 50 years ago. I show it in lectures. I'm not going to do that today. But I did a study 50 years ago that had the same strategic structure as what we've done in the last 2.5 days at the University of Georgia 50 years later. The technology is different, but the conceptual structure is the same. The geography is different, the models are different, the analyses are different, the demands are different, everything is different, but the way you think through the problem is identical. And so no, it's not new. What was the second piece of your question?
Would you consider it repackaging older ideas?
No, it's adapting older ideas. That's not repackaging, and it's not renaming them. It's taking pieces of older ideas and saying, really, these are things you have to do between the present and the future if you're going to think about the future. Repackaging, yeah, you can say repackaging. It's not as nice a word as adapting.
So you're going from survey to analysis?
It's, in fact, very different from that, because you don't know what to survey.
Well, can you explain your framework?
My framework raises 3 questions. First of all, there are 6 questions involved in the framework, and you need the diagram. I'll explain it verbally, but it's easier on the diagram, because it's a very simple diagram. There are 6 questions. How do we describe the landscape? I'll use the word landscape. I use the word context because it might not be considered a landscape. How do we describe it, the context that we're working in? How does it work? And that's in terms of systems. Third question, is it working well? The first question is data. The second question is knowledge, basically. The third question is values. And those 3 questions you can apply to the existing and past conditions. And scientists do that very, very well. The fourth question is, how might it change? And that's actually just data. It's a different state of the conditions present. The fifth question is, what difference does it make? And these are impact models. The sixth question is, what should we do? And those are decision models. And in the why questions, the first round of passing through these questions, you're saying, why are we here? What are we trying to do? And you talk to people, you look at information, you look at maps, but it's unorganized. You're just getting a sense of where we are and what we're trying to do. And the first question you might ask is, where are we? And you need a map. And then eventually you figure out that there are issues here, people are worried about change, there are different groups with different interests, and they each have different decision models. The second pass through, you do it in exactly the reverse order, and that's, how are we going to work together? Who has to be part of the team? Who plays what role? And it's a collaboration between the people of the place, the scientists, the designers, design professionals, and the information management people. And that when you decide how to attack a problem, you don't start with data, you start with the decision model. How are they going to know they've got a good design coming out the end? How do they evaluate a design in terms of those systems? Which is most important, which is less important? And if you know what those systems are and how important they are, you know what impact models you need. And if you know what impact models you need, you know what the language of the design needs to be. It needs to be in those systems. And if you know the language of the design, you know what the evaluations need to be, the present case that you're changing. And if you know what the impacts are, you know what process models you need. And if you know what process models you need, only now do you know what data you need. And I want the least data that solves my problem. So that's how we design how to work. And the third set of questions is, well, what goes where and when and how? And now what you're doing from your perspective, typically as being given a client or a problem statement, you're saying, well, let me get the data, let me build the models, let me evaluate, let me start figuring out changes, let me compare them, and let me propose something for impact, for a decision. But in fact, geodesign is the whole thing. The why questions, the how questions, and the carry out, the actual study of the work questions. And so I think the most important thing is not the data at all. In fact, I like in the beginning of a study to work with really simple data in a language that everybody understands, which is color code, simple English, and maps. And I don't want the best data. I don't know what I need, so why should I spend my time dealing with very detailed data, which is abroad in the land for almost everything? So no. I start with what is the decision model or the group of decision models? What do we need to do to get to the future? And that leads to all the other pieces of the puzzle that then have to be put together. And in that sense, geodesign is a fundamental inversion of what most people are taught as the design method, which is pure nonsense. There are lots of design methods, but they all have to begin with, how do I know I've got a good design? Not with data.
What can design schools do to better prepare students to excel as professionals?
Adopt a geodesign approach. Now, that works across scale, but it works better for big projects. If you're designing a garden, let me take the case of a garden. Let's say that I wrote a paper in 1990 about the same framework, and I used the example of the design of a garden for the chess master, the master of playing chess. I'm going to come to you, you're the landscape architect, and say, I'm the world champion in chess, and I want a garden on my palace. And you say to me, well, what kind of a garden are you thinking about? I said, I think I have a very clear idea of what I'm thinking about. I want a garden with black gravel and white flowers, and I want it in a checkerboard. And then I want topiary that represents the chess players, and I want it to be about an acre square. In other words, I'm telling you what my decision model is. I'm not telling you what the design is or where it should be. And you say, my God, this guy is crazy. But that's maybe a design that I should try out. And then your problem then is, which plants are white? Which stone is black? How am I going to under-drain it? How am I going to make the plants grow if it's in gravel that's white and black? How am I going to deal with that? How am I going to make it not hot because I'm in Georgia and the sun shines? But the key step was, I'm not coming to you to tell me what kind of garden I have. I'm going to tell you what kind of garden I want. So my decision model drives the process. Now let's say that you're the chairman of the board, the board, I don't know what the board is in Chatham County. Now we're in Chatham County. And somebody is the director-in-chief of Chatham County. He's got selectmen, I don't know what they're called in Georgia. In Massachusetts, it would be the chairman of the board of selectmen. And these people are responsible for making policy. And they're going to come to you as the person managing geodesign, and they're going to say, you know what's really important for us? Jobs, environment, and water. And you'd better consider having a historian, a geologist, a climate person, a transport person, a housing person, a climate change person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're the ones who are defining what's important, right? And if you say, I'm going to put a stamp collector on my team, and they can say, why? You follow me? And so this idea that the decision model is the politics of the place, plus some science that they may not agree with. Because it's not always the case that you follow what you're told. Right? You have a responsibility for broadening that. But the key is that why question, your exploration of the why question, tells you, I need these people to work with me on this problem. And then what you need is a structure to cause them to work together. That's what the geodesign piece is. And then you can treat them as specialists, giving you advice. You could treat them as generalists, telling you how to put the systems together in a design, how to assess the composite design, and which ones and how to propose them back to these people who are going to make the decision, either in a referendum or by their own power of responsibility. So, again, it's the same thing. It's the decision process which determines the flow of the project, not you as the creative designer. And the bigger the project, the less you as the creative designer play a role. You have to be intelligent, you have to be smart, you have to be creative, by the way. But I'm not hiring you because you're brilliant. I'm hiring you because you know something.
Well, what's the difference between a good designer and a great designer?
The concept of a good designer versus a great designer at the scale of a garden is publicity. And it's overblown, really overblown. The concept at the scale of redesigning Chatham County for 50 years from now, it's an irrelevant question. Who cares if there's a great designer or something? That's just an irrelevant concept that there's a great designer. And if you're redesigning, let's say, all of Georgia, let alone all of the United States, what does it mean to be a great designer? It means nothing. It's whether you've figured out what the pieces are and put them together, and other people decide. Other people decide if it's a good design. And if you do a couple that are successful, somebody will say, well, he's done this, maybe he's done this well, he'll adapt to your situation, and you build a reputation. I mean, I have a reputation from this kind of work that I do. I've done it a lot. Am I a great designer? Who knows? Other people will decide that. It's just not a publicity type thing.
In regards to teaching and your experiences with students, what makes a good student?
That's a very interesting. Passion, intelligence, energy. There are two categorically different styles of teaching. One is when you're teaching something for which there is a right answer. And you can do that by telling the student what the right answer is, or you can tell the student, ask the student what the question is, and if they come up with the right answer, you say, that's very good, thank you very much. But there's another group of projects where there is no right answer. And not only that, where the muddling through a complicated problem is the task, not to come up with the right answer, but to figure out how the process works. Do you know that I've taught studios for 45 years? I've never, ever, ever given a client a site and a program. I tell my students, out there's a problem. You figure out what the clients, plural, are, what the site should be, if maybe there's more than one at different scales, and what the program is. And the program may be vague and have a high and low range. And they have to figure that out, and they have to figure out how to attack it. I've never given the classic client problem, site problem, because my projects are too big, they're too uncertain. And uncertainty is part of the problem that they have to cope with. Not only that, I change frequently in my studio, I change the assumptions midway through and see if they've got a design that can adapt. So I teach in a very different style in my studios, and I've done it for a long time.
Do you find that to be very successful?
Yes, I produce students who can think. And let me make a distinction. There are some faculty correctly and some incorrectly who teach students what to think. And in my work, I teach them how to think.
In your professional life, has there ever been a time that you failed?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, what did that teach you?
Taught me to try again. Sometimes failure is not your fault. It may be the circumstances. It may be your fault. I don't think I've ever failed and blamed myself. Keep in mind that if you were a baseball player and you hit the ball fair once every 3 times, you'd be making $20 million a year. Failure sometimes happens when a good plan or a good design is not implemented because of people changing, politics changing. Implementation is very rare. I've had some real successes, but I've had many times that something that I've studied for a public purpose, and sometimes for a private purpose, but mainly I do public purpose work, simply was ignored. I've had that happen many times. It's a fact of professional life.
Tess was telling me that you were trained as an architect.
That's correct.
How did you end up here?
Oh, that's an interesting accident. I have a bachelor's degree in architecture from Cornell. I practiced for a while. I have a master's in architecture from MIT. I was in the studio when the PhD program in urban design and planning opened, and I walked downstairs and I was admitted immediately with a full scholarship. I was Kevin Lynch's first doctoral student. Kevin Lynch, when I was an undergraduate, Hideo Sasaki was a visiting critic at Cornell, and I did a project which he remembered. When I was an architecture student, I worked 20 hours a week for the Sasaki firm in landscape architecture. I did all the paving details for the St. Louis Zoo, for example. But I had to eat. Now, when I was finishing my doctorate, I had a couple of interviews, but I wanted to stay in Boston for personal reasons. And in those days, academic appointment was simpler. And I didn't know at the time, but Kevin Lynch was a neighbor of Hideo Sasaki, and they talked. And Hideo said, "I'm sure, I know that guy, he's working for me." And so I got an interview and I was hired. And then I was one of the first people in the computer graphics lab. And when I did the first regional study using computer modeling. It was I did my thesis using computer graphics, but that was in 1965, 50 years ago now. And at the end of that, I had a joint appointment in planning and landscape architecture. And planning at that time was moving toward microeconomic and public policy stuff and away from physical planning. And my appointment was not renewed in the planning department. It was a one-year appointment. And landscape architecture said, "I want you." And so I joined full-time the landscape faculty, and I've been there ever since. So I'm probably the only professor at Harvard who has no academic degree or professional license in the field in which he's professor. And I've been I've been on the faculty as professor of landscape architecture and planning as full professor since 1973. And now I'm professor emeritus. But I've learned a lot from my students, from giving them problems that they had to learn when I watched what they were doing. But in point of fact, I know how to draw, and I've designed buildings, and I've worked on regions, and I'm a generalist in terms of physical planning.
You started to bring up learning how to draw. And the time that I've spent with you, I've seen that you don't carry a camera.
I don't carry a camera.
You only carry a sketchbook.
That's correct.
Can you tell me more about that and why?
Because I live with a woman who always carries a camera, and we're always together, sort of. No, I decided 20 years ago that I saw more by drawing than by photographing. And I knew how to draw, so I started drawing. I've got drawings of every place I've been. So I'm very good at looking at places and sort of understanding them and making notes by drawing. And I do that. I carry a sketch pad with me all the time. I don't carry a camera because I've got other ways to get photographs. And if I didn't have that, I may carry a camera. I probably wouldn't. I have a visual memory. I can't remember names, but I can remember and probably draw every place I've ever been. And by the way, a phone. I don't have a smartphone. I don't like them. I have a phone, but I'm not one of these people who's always on. I don't use any social media, none. I hate them. Somebody wants to get to me, they know how to get to me. And if they don't know how to get to me, they probably shouldn't get to me.
In closing, can you tell me something about yourself that most people wouldn't know?
Yeah, I can tell you lots of things about myself that a lot of people don't know, but I will tell you something else. I usually have a schedule that is about a year ahead. In other words, I sort of know now already where I'm going to be in November, but I know that in the second week of October I'm going to be fishing. I have always taken the second week of October, gone to Utah State University, given a lecture or two, and then gone fishing in Idaho and Montana. And I've done this for 45 years in a row, and it's my mental health break. Because when I'm on the water there and with my friends who are all landscape architects, I don't think business. And I think it's really, really important for people not to be consumed by their work. I know how to turn off, in other words. And the last time I stayed up all night on something was in graduate school, and I decided that was totally unproductive. So I have ways of turning off and tuning out, as they say. And yet when I'm working, it's very high energy, and I'm not a young guy. But I'm able to do it because I have this ability to turn up and tune out, or turn up and be really, really intense about what I'm doing, because I like doing it.
Well, thank you so much, Carl.
You're welcome.